Imagine your country loses a third of its wealth.
Right, and we aren't talking about a temporary dip in the stock market here.
No, exactly. Not a bad quarter. I mean, a massive systemic contraction of national income that doesn't just last a year, but stretches out over a decade and a half.
Which, by all standard laws of economics, the outcome there is completely predictable.
You'd think so, right? Your schools should begin to crumble, your hospitals should struggle to maintain basic care, and your society should basically fray at the edges.
It's the standard austerity spiral.
Yeah. But today, we are looking at a country that suffered exactly that kind of catastrophic financial drop and somehow ended up with the 29th highest standard of living on Earth.
It's a scenario that genuinely breaks the traditional models of how we understand national prosperity.
Welcome, everyone, to today's custom-tailored deep dive. We know you're here because you're the kind of learner who wants to cut through the surface-level noise.
You want those deep aha moments.
Exactly. You want to understand the actual mechanics of how the world works beneath the headlines. So our mission today is to decode a mind-bending economic and social paradox straight from the source data.
And it's a fascinating one.
It really is. We are talking about a microstate, San Marino, which is completely landlocked by Italy, and their gross national income, or GNI per capita, plummeted by a staggering 34.5% between its peak in 2007 and 2023.
And to put real numbers to that, because the numbers matter here, their GNI per capita dropped from over $98,641 down to $64,706.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, for almost any other sovereign entity, a sustained loss of that magnitude triggers a generational collapse in human development.
But San Marino didn't collapse.
No, they didn't.
Their Human Development Index didn't crash. Instead, their world ranking stabilized securely at 29th out of 203 countries.
Which is just, it's incredible.
So our core question for this deep dive is simply, how? What is the architecture of this asymmetric growth model? How does a nation shrink its economy so drastically on paper, yet continue to lead the globe in health, knowledge, and gender equality?
Well, the answer requires us to completely dismantle how we measure the concept of success.
Right.
Because if we try to solve the San Marino paradox using only traditional economic metrics, we're going to fail. We have to understand the multidimensional dashboard that modern analysts use to measure actual human well-being.
Okay, I want to stick with that dashboard analogy, actually, because I used to be guilty of this myself. I used to judge a country's success purely by its GDP or GNI.
Most people do. It's the loudest number.
Yeah, but judging a society by its top-line revenue is like judging a car solely by its top speed.
That's a great way to put it.
Because knowing a car can hit 200 miles per hour is, it's an interesting metric, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the underlying mechanics.
Do the brakes work?
Right. Is the steering aligned? Are the passengers inside actually safe? Or is the engine overheating? If we want to understand how San Marino survived this crash, we need to look at the other dials on the dashboard.
And the source material provides us with 5 specific dials, 5 multidimensional metrics that tell us what is actually happening to the passengers inside the vehicle.
Okay, lay them out for us.
So the primary dial, the overarching metric, is the HDI, or the Human Development Index.
Break that down. What actually goes into that specific dial?
Well, the HDI was engineered specifically to pull our obsession away from pure national income. It forces us to look at people-centered policies. So it operates on 3 pillars.
Okay.
The first is a long and healthy life, which is measured by life expectancy at birth.
Makes sense.
The second pillar is access to knowledge, and that calculates both the expected years of schooling for a child just entering the system and the mean years of schooling actually achieved by the adult population.
Right. And the third?
Finally, the third pillar is a decent standard of living, which is where that gross national income per capita comes back into play.
So the HDI does care about money.
It does, yes.
But it forces the money to sit in the back seat and share the ride with health and education. It's an aggregate score.
Exactly.
But obviously, an aggregate score can hide a lot of internal flaws, right?
Yeah.
We only look at the average. We miss the nuances of who is actually benefiting from that health and education. So what are the other dials?
This is where we introduce the gender indexes, the GDI and the GII.
Okay.
The Gender Development Index, or GDI, takes those exact same 3 pillars of the HDI, health, education, and income, and separates them out by gender.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it calculates the ratio of female to male development. If the score is 1.0, you have perfect parity.
And the GII.
Meanwhile, the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, measures the darker side of the spectrum. It looks at reproductive health, female empowerment in politics, and labor market participation gaps.
Meaning these dials tell us if half the population is being systemically left behind.
Precisely.
Because a country could have a really high HDI, but if the men are living to 80 and going to college, while the women are denied basic education and healthcare, the GDI will flag that massive internal failure.
That's exactly how it works. Which leads us to the fourth dial, and arguably the most critical for understanding societal resilience.
Okay, what's on?
It's the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
I actually have a lot of questions about this one.
Yeah.
Because this measures the internal loss of a society, right?
Yes.
Like how much of the national progress is hoarded by a few versus shared by the many. But I want to push back on this conceptually for a second.
Go for it.
In traditional economic theory, we often hear that a rising tide lifts all boats.
Sure, the trickle-down idea.
Right. If a country is wildly wealthy, even if that wealth is concentrated at the top, doesn't the sheer volume of money eventually fund better hospitals and schools for everyone? Why does inequality intrinsically lower the overall development score?
It's a fundamental question. The rising tide theory assumes that wealth seamlessly translates into accessible public goods. But the data shows that extreme inequality creates massive structural friction.
How so?
Think of the baseline HDI as the maximum potential of a society. The IHDI is the actual lived reality of the average citizen once you account for the unequal distribution of those goods.
Okay, I'm tracking.
So if you have one billionaire with access to private, world-class health care and 9 citizens who can't afford a basic checkup, the mathematical average of their health outcomes might look acceptable on paper.
Because the billionaire skews the average way up.
Exactly. But the IHDI penalizes that score because the distribution of that health is profoundly inefficient.
I see. So it's not just about having the resources, it's about the delivery mechanism.
Yes.
The IHDI measures the leak in the bucket. If a society is perfectly equal, the HDI and the IHDI are the exact same number.
Yeah.
But the wider the gap between the rich and poor, the more the IHDI plummets below the baseline.
Spot on. And our final dial is the most modern constraint we have. The PHDI, or the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
This one fundamentally shifts how we view success, I think, because it introduces the ultimate biological constraint, which is the Earth itself. How does the math on that actually work? Like, how do you dock points from a country's health and education score based on planetary pressure?
The mechanism is actually quite elegant. The index calculates a country's level of carbon dioxide emissions per capita and its material footprint per capita.
Material footprint meaning what?
Meaning the sheer tonnage of natural resources extracted to sustain its lifestyle. So it creates an adjustment factor based on those 2 planetary boundaries.
Wow. Right.
So if a country is achieving a high standard of living, but is doing so by heavily polluting and rapidly extracting finite resources, the PHDI mathematically slashes their development score.
It asks a really hard question then.
It asks.
Is your current prosperity genuine, or is it just a high-interest loan taken out against the future of the planet?
That is beautifully put. Exactly.
So as you are listening to this, I want you to evaluate your own community through this dashboard. Is your country wealthy on paper, but struggling with massive internal inequality?
Or does it have high top-speed economic growth, but relies on a labor force that structurally sidelines women?
Right. Or maybe it's achieving a great standard of living right now, but it's cashing out the local environment to do so. We need all 5 of these dials to understand the true health of a nation.
And before we can zoom in on the specific anomaly of San Marino, we need to establish the global baseline.
We have to calibrate these dials by looking at what the rest of the human race has been doing over the last 30 years.
Exactly.
Let's start with the big picture, which is actually an incredible story of global progress. If we track the primary dial, the overarching HDI, the trajectory of humanity, has been a steady upward climb.
It really has.
Back in 1990, the global HDI was sitting at 0.608. By 2023, it had climbed to 0.756.
And we shouldn't gloss over that. Moving a global aggregate score from 0.608 to 0.756 is a monumental planetary scale achievement.
Yeah, that's billions of people.
Literally billions of individual human beings gaining access to vaccines, clean water, secondary education, and formal economic systems. It is the steady pulse of human advancement.
But the chart isn't a perfectly smooth line, is it? There's a severe jagged edge right near the end of our timeline.
Yeah, if you look closely at the data, the global HDI hit a historic peak of 0.745 in 2019. But then we see a dramatic and incredibly rare macro-level backslide.
The pandemic.
Right. Across 2020 and 2021, the global index dropped to 0.742.
The COVID-19 shock.
Yes. And it was uniquely devastating because it was a simultaneous attack on all three pillars of the index.
It wasn't just a catastrophic loss of life expectancy.
No, it was an education crisis with global school closures and a severe economic contraction as supply chains froze. It erased several years of accumulated human development in a matter of months.
Wow.
Now, we are currently in a recovery phase, reaching that 0.756 mark in 2023, but the trauma of that dip proves how fragile progress can be.
And that fragility leads us directly into a much deeper systemic problem, because that global HDI of 0.756, it's largely an illusion.
It is.
It is a mathematical average that masks a severe global failure. Because when we bring in that fourth dial, the IHDI, the leaky bucket metric, the narrative changes entirely.
Completely changes. When we adjust the global score for inequality, the floor gives way.
Yeah.
The global IHDI for 2023 plummets to 0.590.
I have a hard time wrapping my head around the scale of that drop from 0.756 down to 0.590. What does that actually mean for the average person on Earth?
In practical terms, it means the world loses roughly 21.9% of its human development achievements purely due to unequal distribution.
21.9%.
Over a fifth of all global progress is essentially vaporized because it is hoarded rather than shared.
So the global bucket is leaking 22% of its water.
Yes.
And the source material actually lets us isolate exactly where those leaks are coming from. Where are we losing the most ground?
The data reveals that the structural holes are primarily in income and education. Inequality in income causes a massive 30.4% loss globally.
30%, that is huge.
It's staggering. And educational inequality causes a 21.5% loss. By comparison, inequality in life expectancy causes a lower, though still significant, loss of 12.9%.
This highlights a terrifying reality, really. If you're born into a marginalized demographic or a developing region, your access to wealth generation and quality schooling is artificially capped.
It's a structural barrier.
And this brings up a massive philosophical debate. If a society is leaking over 20% of its potential, what is the policy solution? Do we just pour more water into the bucket? Do we blindly chase higher GDP targets, hoping to outgrow the leak? Or do we stop the machine and weld the hole shut?
That debate defines modern development economics. Historically, the dominant strategy was simply to pour more water.
Just grow the economy.
Right. The assumption was that sheer economic volume would overwhelm the inefficiencies of inequality. But the IHDI data definitively prove that the leaks are too large to outpace.
You can't outearn a leaf that big.
You cannot simply outgrow a 30% drag on income efficiency. A structural flaw requires a structural repair.
And as we are going to see, welding those holes shut is exactly what allowed San Marino to survive its financial crisis. But before we get to their solution, there are two more global ceilings we have to acknowledge. Two massive barriers that are capping humanity's potential right now.
The first barrier is the gender gap. We've discussed the Gender Inequality Index, the GDI. Historically, there has been improvement here. The global GDI improved from 0.582 back in 1993 down to 0.455 in 2023.
And just a reminder, a lower score here means less inequality.
Correct.
So that sounds like progress. But when we look at the specific mechanisms making up that score, the underlying reality is shocking. Specifically, the labor force participation gap.
Yes, the labor gap is glaring.
Right now, global female labor force participation sits at just 48.5%. Meanwhile, male participation is 74.1%.
That leaves a 25.6 percentage point chasm between the genders.
I want to dig into the why here, because is this just a matter of personal choice? Are women simply opting out of the formal economy globally?
The data overwhelmingly suggests it is not a matter of pure voluntary choice, but of systemic constraint.
Like what?
That 25.6% gap represents millions of women who are structurally sidelined by a lack of childcare infrastructure, the disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic labor, cultural barriers, and in some regions, explicit legal restrictions on property ownership and employment.
From a purely analytical standpoint, keeping half of your population locked out of the formal economy is baffling.
It's incredibly inefficient.
It's like a factory manager intentionally shutting down 50% of the assembly line and then wondering why the factory's total output is lagging.
The inefficiency is staggering. And this gender ceiling extends into basic survival metrics as well.
Yeah, let's talk about the health side of that.
Global maternal mortality, the number of mothers dying per 100,000 live births, has dropped from 365 in 1990 down to 216 in 2023.
Which is good. That signifies millions of lives saved.
It does, but the underlying trend line is worrying. The rate of improvement is actively decelerating. We are hitting a wall on maternal health under our current global healthcare model.
So we have the inequality leak, we have the systemic gender ceiling, and now we hit the final, insurmountable constraint, the planetary pressure test.
This is where we really have to reckon with the physical limits of our planet. When we apply the GDI dial, the sobering truth is revealed. Our high global development score is heavily subsidized by ecological extraction.
Subsidized is a polite way of putting it.
Well, adjusting for planetary pressures drops the global HDI score by another 10.1%.
10% wiped out.
Yeah.
And what are the actual mechanics driving that 10% penalty? What are we doing to earn that downgrade?
The penalty is driven by two massive figures. First, the global average is burdened by 4.54 tons of per capita carbon dioxide emissions.
Okay.
Second, we have a material footprint of 12.7 tons per person.
Let's visualize that for a second. 12.7 tons. That means to sustain our current global standard of living, we are literally digging up, cutting down, and extracting over 25,000 pounds of biomass, fossil fuels, and metal ores for every single human being on Earth, every single year.
It is an incredibly aggressive rate of extraction. The environment is effectively acting as an uncredited investor in our human development, and we are rapidly depleting the principal.
So if we synthesize everything we've looked at on the global dashboard so far,
Yeah.
humanity is indeed moving forward. We are living longer and learning more than we were 30 years ago.
Yes.
But that growth is highly unstable. It is severely unequal. It artificially restricts female potential, and it relies on an unsustainable rate of planetary extraction.
Which perfectly sets the stage for our central mystery. With all of those global constraints in mind, how does a highly vulnerable microstate navigate a financial collapse?
Let's finally zoom in on the San Marino paradox.
Let's do it.
Let's do a head-to-head comparison. We established the global average HDI is 0.756. Where does San Marino sit?
San Marino's HDI is an exceptional 0.915.
0.915.
Yes.
That classifies them in the absolute highest possible tier of very high human development. They are miles ahead of the global average.
Out of the 203 nations evaluated in the data, San Marino has secured the 29th spot in the world.
So 29th in the world for health, education, and living standards. If you just heard that stat, you would assume San Marino is experiencing an unprecedented economic boom.
You'd assume their treasury is overflowing.
Right. But we have to return to the economic anomaly we introduced at the top of the show.
Yeah.
Let's look closely at the income dial. San Marino's GNI per capita fell from $98,641 in 2007 down to $64,706 in 2023.
A 34.5% contraction.
I really need to emphasize how abnormal it is for a country to survive this. If a major Western economy lost 34% of its per capita income, it would be dominating the global news cycle for a decade.
It would be framed as a societal apocalypse.
Exactly. You would expect a healthcare system to ration care, you'd expect mass layoffs in the education sector, you'd expect crime and inequality to skyrocket.
In a traditional model, that is exactly what happens. The in-care dimension of the HDI is deeply intertwined with the other pillars. When national wealth plummets, the state usually implements severe austerity measures. They slash funding to social services, which almost immediately drags down the health and education scores.
Yet San Marino defied that gravity.
They did.
Their overall HDI rank stabilized. They took a 34% pay cut and held on to the 29th spot in the world. What is the mechanism behind that resilience?
The data points to a profound strategy of front-loaded investment. Economic volatility did not destroy their social welfare because their welfare was no longer entirely dependent on month-to-month economic growth.
I think the best way to understand this is the analogy of a heavily fortified house. Let's say you secure a massively high-paying job for 20 years.
Okay.
You could spend that money purely on consumable luxury, expensive dinners, designer clothes, things that vanish the moment you buy them.
The top-speed car from earlier.
Right, exactly. But instead, you make structural choices. You pay off the mortgage entirely. You install a massive solar array so your energy is free. You build an internal water filtration system. You put your children's entire college tuition into an untouchable pre-funded trust.
You convert temporary income into permanent load-bearing infrastructure.
Yes. Then a massive recession hits your industry. You lose your job and have to take a new one that pays 35% less.
That's a painful psychological blow.
It is. You aren't buying new cars anymore. Your top-line revenue looks terrible.
Hmm?
But your lived reality doesn't actually collapse.
Because the baseline is secure.
Right. You don't lose your home because there is no mortgage. The lights stay on because of the solar panels. Your kids still go to college because the trust is already funded. Your day-to-day human development remains extremely high because you effectively child-proofed your life against an economic downturn.
And San Marino executed that exact strategy on a macroeconomic scale. During their peak wealth years leading up to 2007, they didn't just inflate their GDP with ephemeral spending, they built incredibly durable, universal institutions.
The solar panels and the trust funds.
Exactly. They created a social safety net that doesn't instantly evaporate the moment tax revenues dip.
So let's open up the hood and examine the specific engines that are keeping this 0.915 HDI score afloat despite the recession. Let's look at the engines of longevity and intellect.
We can start with the health pillar. San Marino's life expectancy at birth is an astonishing 85.7 years.
85.7 years.
Yeah.
The global average is 73.4. Just by virtue of being born in San Marino, a citizen is statistically gifted more than an extra decade of life compared to the global baseline.
And if we trace their historical trajectory, this wasn't an overnight miracle. Since 1990, San Marino steadily added about 8 years to its life expectancy. This steady accumulation suggests a healthcare model heavily weighted toward preventative medicine, comprehensive maternal care, and robust geriatric support systems that catch illnesses early.
But the true test of load-bearing infrastructure isn't how it functions on a sunny day. It's how it handles a massive external shock.
Which brings us back to the pandemic. The COVID-19 data provides a fascinating stress test for San Marino's health system.
Right. Because of where they are.
Exactly, because they are completely surrounded by Italy, which was the epicenter of the early European outbreak. San Marino could not avoid the crisis. Their life expectancy took a severe hit, dropping down to 82.6 years in 2020.
Losing 3 full years of life expectancy in a single year is a brutal demographic trauma.
It is. But the critical metric is what happened immediately after the shock.
What happened?
The very next year, the data shows an aggressive bounce back. By 2022, life expectancy had surged back up, reaching 87.1 years for females and 84.1 years for males.
That rapid rebound is the proof of concept. It shows that while the virus caused immediate casualties, it didn't permanently break the health infrastructure.
Right, the system didn't fold.
The hospitals didn't go bankrupt. The medical supply chains were rapidly reestablished. The institutional knowledge and capacity of their medical professionals held firm. The foundation weathered the hurricane.
Now let's transition to the second engine, the education system.
I find the education metrics to be the most compelling because they act as a leading indicator. Health tells you how a society is doing today. Education tells you how it will survive tomorrow.
That's very true.
San Marino has an expected years of schooling at 14.6 years, and a mean, which is the actual average years achieved by the adult population, of 11.36 years.
A mean of over 11 years is significant. It implies that the overwhelming majority of their adult workforce has completed comprehensive secondary education and transitioned into vocational or tertiary training.
It's a highly literate, highly adaptable talent pool.
Exactly. But the truly staggering data point isn't the total number of years, it's the distribution of those years. This is where San Marino achieves something incredibly rare.
You're referring to the gender parity in education.
Yes. If we look at the specific breakdown, females in San Marino have a mean of 11.34 years of schooling. Males have a mean of 11.38 years.
A gap of 0.04 years. That is statistical noise. They have practically achieved a zero education gap. But I want to explore why that is so vital during an economic recession. How does keeping that gap at zero actually protect the country from the 34% drop in GNI?
Well, it acts as an economic shield. In many societies, when national wealth shrinks and household budgets tighten, education becomes a luxury. And historically, the marginalized demographic, usually young women, are the first to be pulled out of school to enter the informal labor market or take over unpaid care duties.
I see.
When a country allows that to happen, they are effectively amputating their future intellectual capital to solve a short-term financial problem.
That's so short-sighted.
It is. The fact that San Marino maintains perfect parity suggests that education is deeply entrenched as an untouchable universal right. They refuse to cannibalize their own human capital, regardless of the economic weather.
Which flows directly into what I believe is the absolute core of the San Marino paradox. We've talked about health and education, but the real secret sauce holding this entire microstate together is their radical commitment to gender equality and internal fairness.
It's the anchor.
Equality isn't just a moral imperative for them. It is the structural glue that prevents the society from shattering when the economy shrinks.
The data on their gender integration is extraordinary. San Marino's Gender Development Index, the GDI, sits firmly in Global Group 1, scoring an outstanding 0.991.
Meaning they are in the absolute highest global tier for gender parity across health, education, and income.
Yes, but there is a historical anomaly in the data that reveals just how deeply rooted this equality is.
Oh, what is it?
If we look at the decades spanning from 2000 to 2010, San Marino's GDI actually consistently remained above 1.0.
Wait, what does a score above 1.0 literally mean in this context?
So the index calculates the ratio of female to male development. A score of exactly 1.0 is perfect mathematical equality.
Okay.
A score above 1.0 means that during that specific decade, women in San Marino were technically experiencing higher overall human development outcomes than the male population.
Wait, really?
Yes. Their combined achievements in longevity, educational attainment, and standard of living were slightly outpacing men.
That is almost unheard of on a national macroeconomic scale.
It is an extreme rarity. Today, it has stabilized to a near-perfect equilibrium of 0.991. But that historical ascendance during the early 2000s laid a concrete foundation for massive female empowerment in both the workforce and in political leadership.
Let's track how that empowerment translates into economic resilience. Earlier, we discussed the global ceiling on female labor force participation, which is stuck at a dismal 48.5%. How does San Marino compare?
San Marino boasts an incredible 70.36% female labor force participation rate.
Wow. I want to break down the mechanics of what that 70% actually does for a shrinking economy.
It's transformative.
Because if your nation's GNI per capita drops by 34%, individual households are losing income. But if 70% of your adult women are active in the formal economy, you have a massive prevalence of dual-income households.
Right.
A dual-income household can absorb a macroeconomic shock infinitely better than a single-income household.
The mathematical buffering is immense.
Okay.
Furthermore, a 70% participation rate means a massive portion of the female population is actively generating taxable revenue. They're contributing to the pension systems and maintaining consumer demand.
They're pulling the weight together.
Exactly. They are pulling the economic rate alongside the men, which prevents the tax base from collapsing even when overall top-line growth stalls.
And when you have that level of embedded economic power, it inevitably translates into legislative power. The source data shows the female share of parliament seats in San Marino climbed dramatically. Back in 1990, it was a mere 11.7%. By 2023, it had surged to 33.3%.
A full third of the national legislature is female.
Let's connect the dots here. Why does the demographic makeup of the parliament matter when we are trying to solve an economic paradox? What is the causality?
The causality lies in legislative prioritization. Extensive sociological studies demonstrate that when female representation in government crosses certain critical mass thresholds, usually around 30%, the actual nature of the legislation changes.
You get different laws passed.
You see a marked increase in the defense of social infrastructure. Funding for early childhood education, robust maternity and paternity leave policies, and comprehensive health care tend to be fiercely protected.
So when the 2007 financial crisis hit and San Marino's GNI began its massive descent, the politicians had to make budget cuts.
Everyone did.
But a parliament with 33% female representation, backed by a highly educated female workforce participating at 70%, is structurally highly unlikely to gut the health and education systems.
They won't touch the foundation.
Right. They will look for austerity measures elsewhere, perhaps delaying infrastructure projects or adjusting trade tariffs, rather than dismantling the load-bearing social safety net their families rely on.
The power is distributed, which means the pain of the recession is managed collectively rather than offloaded onto the most vulnerable demographics.
Oh.
And we can mathematically prove this collective management by returning to our fourth dial, the IHDI.
The measure of internal leaks.
Right. While the global average loses nearly 22% of its development progress to the massive structural holes of inequality, San Marino operates what we can call a low-loss model.
Let's hear the numbers.
The numbers are stark. Their loss in life expectancy due to inequality is a mere 1.7%.
I really want you to grasp what a 1.7% loss actually looks like on the ground. It means that if you map out the entire population of San Marino, the difference in life expectancy between the wealthiest CEO and a standard retail worker is statistically negligible.
That's the perfect example.
In a highly unequal society, the wealthy might live to 85 with private doctors, while the working class dies at 65 due to lack of preventative care. A 1.7% loss means the hospital door is genuinely equally open to everyone,
And we see the exact same efficiency in their intellectual capital. Their education inequality loss is barely 4.1%.
which implies there isn't a massive chasm between elite, well-funded private academies and crumbling public schools. The baseline quality is universally high. So if we step back and look at the architecture of San Marino's success, it is not a tall, fragile tower balancing on top of immense wealth.
No, it's not.
It is a wide, sturdy pyramid. The wealth they do have, even after a 34% drop, is distributed with near-perfect efficiency across the entire base of the population. The bucket has almost no leaks.
That is how you survive an economic collapse without losing your humanity.
It's a profound masterclass in societal resilience.
Yeah.
But as objective analysts, we must interrogate the entire data set.
Oh.
A sturdy pyramid is still subject to erosion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, we promised you the full picture. San Marino sounds like an absolute utopia, but nothing is immune to pressure. What are the subtle cracks forming in the foundation? Let's explore the hidden vulnerabilities of a microstate.
If we look closely at the multi-decade trends, there are subtle warning lights flashing on the dashboard. Let's return to the education engine.
Okay, what's flashing there?
Well, while the current mean years of schooling is high and highly equitable, the expected years of schooling actually saw a micro-regression.
A drop.
Yes. In the year 2000, the expected years of schooling for a child in San Marino peaked at 15.6 years. But by 2023, that expectation had slowly drifted downward to 14.6 years.
It lost a full year of expected schooling. Why would that happen in a society that so fiercely protects its intellectual capital?
The data doesn't explicitly outline the qualitative sociological reasons, but in highly open microstates, this trend often points to complex external dependencies.
Like what?
It's possible that the sustained economic contraction has subtly shifted incentives, prompting more young people to enter the vocational workforce slightly earlier, rather than pursuing extended tertiary degrees.
Okay, I could see that.
Alternatively, it could reflect changes in how higher education is pursued. Perhaps more students are studying abroad in Italy or elsewhere in Europe, which might alter domestic statistical tracking.
That makes sense.
However, regardless of the cause, a full-year drop over 2 decades is a metric that requires intense policy vigilance. You do not want the engine of future innovation to start losing RPMs.
And then we have to address the elephant in the room, the ongoing volatility of the national income. We have rightly praised them for surviving a 34.5% drop in GNI, but a drop is still a drop.
Precisely. The paid-off house analogy works brilliantly for surviving a 10 or 15-year shock. You can coast on prior structural investments for a while. Your hospitals will remain world-class because of the advanced equipment you purchased in 2005. Your teaching force is excellent because of the comprehensive training they received in 2010. But sustained, multi-decade economic shrinkage eventually creates hard mathematical limits.
Because eventually, the hospital roof physically needs replacing. Eventually, you need the capital to buy the next generation of MRI machines or update the digital infrastructure of the schools.
You cannot defy macroeconomic gravity forever. A very high HGI score of 0.915 requires a massive amount of ongoing maintenance capital.
Right.
If the GNI per capita does not eventually stabilize and return to a baseline of steady growth, the financial reserves required to maintain that load-bearing infrastructure will simply deplete.
And there is one final massive vulnerability that connects right back to the global ceilings we discussed earlier, the issue of global connectivity and planetary pressure.
San Marino is an enclave. It is entirely enveloped by Italy and deeply integrated into the broader European economic ecosystem.
Which is usually a good thing.
This highly open posture is historically beneficial, yes, but it makes them acutely vulnerable to external macroeconomic shocks.
If the Italian economy sneezes, San Marino catches a cold.
Exactly. Their economic destiny is not entirely sovereign. It is tethered to the health of the surrounding continent. And more broadly, they cannot escape the PHDI gap, the planetary pressures.
Even if San Marino manages its internal equality perfectly and maintains a zero-gender gap, they still exist on a rapidly warming planet with finite resources.
The consequences of global environmental strain, climate-driven agricultural shifts, and global resource depletion operate on a lag.
They take time to hit home.
Right. They take time to deeply impact high-income, well-buffered societies. But the impact is inevitable. The stability of the Mediterranean climate, the reliability of the global supply chains they rely on for essential goods and medicine, these are dictated by planetary boundaries that San Marino has very little control over.
So the ultimate threat to their highly resilient social bubble isn't internal failure. It is external planetary scale disruption.
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay, let's take a breath. We have covered an immense amount of conceptual ground today. We started with the global dashboard, analyzed the massive 22% leaky bucket of inequality, confronted the structural gender and planetary ceilings, and deconstructed the remarkable, gravity-defying pyramid of San Marino's social resilience.
That's a lot of data.
It is. So, to you, our listener, how do we synthesize all of this data? What is the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive?
I believe the source data yields three definitive conclusions.
Okay, lay them out.
First, the concept of decoupling. San Marino serves as undeniable proof that human development and societal health can be decoupled from relentless year-over-year economic growth.
That's massive.
It is. If a nation builds solid, equitable, and highly inclusive social institutions during times of plenty, those institutions act as a massive shock absorber, protecting the population's longevity and intellect during times of severe scarcity.
It's empirical proof that a financial recession does not inherently guarantee a collapse in the human standard of living, provided the structural foundation is sound.
Second, we must acknowledge the complex nature of global resilience. The post-pandemic recovery of the global GDI proves that the human race is highly capable of bouncing back from acute, sudden crises. But the chronic crises, the deeply entrenched 25.6% gender gap in labor participation, and the highly unsustainable rate of planetary resource extraction are the most dangerous variables moving forward. We are hitting systemic ceilings that cannot be broken just by generating more GDP. The internal mechanics of the global economy must fundamentally evolve.
And the third overarching takeaway.
True national prosperity. The data suggests that ultimate success is not defined by peak wealth accumulation, but by the combination of intense internal inclusivity, bringing women fully into economic and political power, keeping inequality losses near zero, and minimizing planetary pressure.
I love that.
The end goal of a sovereign state isn't hoarding cash in a vault, it is the equal, sustainable release of human potential.
Which leaves us with a fascinating macro-level thought experiment to mull over.
Yeah.
A final angle based on the realities we've explored today.
What implications are you considering?
Well, in traditional media and politics, we are conditioned to view a shrinking or even stagnant economy as an apocalyptic scenario. We are told that if the GDP doesn't grow indefinitely, the sky is falling. But right now, the entire globe is hurtling toward an unavoidable hard ceiling on quantitative economic growth.
The planetary boundaries dictate that endless physical extraction is impossible.
Exactly. We are constrained by finite natural resources, as the 10.1% PHDI penalty explicitly warns us. And on top of that, we are standing on the precipice of a massive technological disruption via artificial intelligence, which has the potential to fundamentally alter or eliminate traditional labor incomes on a global scale.
A global economic plateau, or even a period of global economic shrinkage, is an entirely plausible scenario within our lifetimes.
So here's the thought prompt for you to take away. If the global economy were to structurally plateau tomorrow, if the entire world experienced a sudden halt in GNI growth, or even a contraction similar to what San Marino faced, could we apply their shrinking yet thriving model on a macro scale?
It's the ultimate test of global architecture. Could we pivot from quantitative growth to qualitative distribution?
Right. If the sheer volume of global wealth stops expanding, the only way to improve the human condition is to stop the leaks in the bucket. We would have to universally eliminate the 30% inequality loss. We would have to completely dismantle the gender barriers to maximize the efficiency of the talent pool we do have.
It would require a total paradigm shift.
Are we, as a global society, brave enough to stop defining a nation's success by the size of its wallet and start defining it by the equality, health, and resilience of its people?
San Marino's data proves that it is mathematically and sociologically possible to build a house sturdy enough to withstand the end of endless growth. The question is whether we have the political will to build it on a planetary scale.
It's a profound challenge to how we view the future. Thank you all for joining us on this custom deep dive. We hope we delivered the depth and the aha moments you were looking for. Keep questioning the standard metrics. Keep looking past the mathematical averages to see the real human impact. And remember that sometimes the most successful society in the room is the one that manages to fiercely protect its humanity, even when the bank account shrinks. and they have the rank to prove it, securely holding the 29th spot in the world. Until next time.